Sarah Thompson's tired eyes glanced at the digital clock on her car's dashboard. 11:43 p.m. Her night shift at Memorial Hospital had run longer than usual, but that was normal when you were one of the senior administrators. She gently placed her hand on her swollen belly, smiling as she felt her baby girl kick. 6 months pregnant, and already so active. The streets were quiet as she drove through the familiar road home, the same route she had taken for the past 5 years, past the row of sleeping shops and the old park where she planned to take her daughter once she was born. Her black Toyota Camry hummed softly as she stopped at a red light, and she took a moment to adjust the air conditioning. Even in the late hours, the summer heat lingered. In her rear-view mirror, sudden flashing lights pierced the darkness. Sarah checked her speedometer. She had been going exactly at the speed limit. Years of driving had taught her to be extra careful, especially as a black woman driving alone at night. She signaled and pulled over to the right, positioning her car perfectly under a street light. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Always stay where people can see you, baby." Following the procedure she knew by heart, Sarah turned off her engine, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and waited. She could see the police officer in her side mirror, taking his time getting out of his patrol car. Something about his slow, deliberate movements made her stomach tighten, and not from the baby's kicks this time. The officer approached, his flashlight beam almost blinding as he shined it directly into her face through the driver's window. Sarah squinted but kept her hands firmly on the wheel. The name on his badge caught the light. Officer James Collins. "License and registration," he barked, without any greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was harsh, unnecessarily aggressive for a routine traffic stop. "Officer, may I reach for my purse to get my license?" "It's in the passenger seat," Sarah asked politely, remembering to keep her voice steady and calm. Her hospital ID badge hung visibly from her neck, her professional attire neat despite the long shift. "I said license and registration." Officer Collins raised his voice, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. The gesture wasn't lost on Sarah, whose heart began to race. She could feel her baby responding to her stress, moving more actively. "Sir, I'm 6 months pregnant," Sarah explained calmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I just need your permission to reach for my documents. They're right here." She nodded toward her purse without moving her hands. Officer Collins's face hardened. "Get out of the car." "Officer, please, I haven't done anything wrong." "Could you tell me why you pulled me over?" Sarah tried to keep her voice level, professional, the same tone she used when dealing with difficult situations at the hospital. "Out of the car now." Each word came out like a bullet, his face contorting with unexplained anger. He reached for his door handle, and Sarah noticed with growing alarm that his body camera's indicator light was off. Sarah's mind raced. She was on a well-lit street, but traffic was sparse at this hour. Her dash cam was recording. She'd installed it last year after her cousin had a similar encounter, but Officer Collins seemed beyond caring about being recorded. "Sir, I'm happy to cooperate, but I'm pregnant, and I need to move carefully. Please, just tell me what this is about." She could feel tears threatening, but she fought them back. Now wasn't the time to show fear, even though every instinct told her this situation was rapidly spinning out of control. Officer Collins stepped back, speaking into his radio. Sarah couldn't hear what he was saying, but his eyes never left her, filled with an anger she couldn't understand. Her phone sat in its holder on the dashboard, and she desperately wished she could reach for it, call someone, anyone. What she didn't know was that help was already there. In a car parked just 20 feet ahead, someone was watching the entire scene unfold. Someone whose presence would soon change everything about this routine traffic stop that had become anything but routine. Judge Michael Chen hadn't planned to work this late. At 65, after 30 years on the federal bench, he was supposed to be enjoying his retirement. But old habits died hard, and he still found himself reviewing case files in his car after his weekly dinner with his daughter. He had pulled over on Cedar Street to take an important call from a former colleague when the police lights caught his attention. From his parked position just ahead of the developing scene, he watched through his rearview mirror as a black Toyota pulled over. There was something about the way the police officer emerged from his patrol car that made the judge's experienced eyes narrow. In his 3 decades of serving justice, he had developed a keen sense for situations that weren't quite right. Judge Chen ended his phone call quickly. "I'll have to call you back," he told his colleague, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding behind him. He reached for his phone again, this time opening the camera app. Years of handling civil rights cases had taught him the value of documentation. Through his side mirror, he could see the driver clearly, a black woman in professional attire, visibly pregnant, her hands placed correctly on the steering wheel. The judge noticed her hospital ID badge catching the streetlight. Everything about her posture spoke of someone who knew exactly how to handle a police stop. But it was the officer's behavior that set off alarm bells in the judge's mind. Officer Collins, the judge could read his nameplate from his angle, was displaying textbook signs of unnecessary aggression. His hand kept moving to his weapon, his stance was confrontational, and most troublingly, his body camera appeared to be off. "Dear God," Judge Chen muttered as he started recording. He had seen too many cases that started exactly like this. Some had ended in tragedy. He adjusted his position slightly to get a better angle, making sure to capture both the officer's badge number and his actions. The judge's heart rate quickened as he watched Officer Collins's behavior escalate. The woman's voice carried clearly through the quiet night air, calm, professional, and clearly stating her pregnant condition. The officer's responses grew increasingly hostile, each word dripping with unwarranted anger. When Officer Collins ordered her out of the car, Judge Chen knew he had to act. He had spent too many years reading case files about similar incidents that went wrong because no one stepped in. Not this time. Not on his watch. He checked his own appearance in the mirror, his silver hair neat, his suit still crisp despite the late hour. Appearance mattered in moments like these. He had learned that lesson well over his years on the bench. His presence needed to command respect without appearing threatening. As he prepared to step out of his car, Judge Chen made sure his phone was still recording. He slipped his federal judge ID card into his hand, retired or not, it still carried weight. In his other pocket was his bar association card. Credentials mattered in situations like these. Through his mirror, he could see other cars beginning to slow down. A few had stopped, their occupants also pulling out phones to record. But Judge Chen knew from experience that recordings alone weren't always enough. Sometimes, situations like these needed immediate intervention from someone with authority. The sound of Officer Collins's raised voice cut through the night air again. "I said get out of the car." The words were followed by the ominous sound of a car door being forcibly opened. Judge Chen took a deep breath. In his 30 years on the bench, he had handled countless cases of police misconduct. He had read hundreds of reports, viewed thousands of hours of footage, and handed down numerous rulings. But this was different. This time, he wasn't reading about it after the fact. This time, he could actually prevent an injustice before it happened. He opened his car door quietly, straightened his tie, and prepared to step into the situation. Sometimes, he reflected, justice needed to be served outside the courtroom. Sarah's car door flew open with a violent jerk, the sudden motion making her gasp. Officer Collins stood there, his face twisted with anger, his hand gripping the door so hard his knuckles had turned white. The street light cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look even more menacing. "I won't tell you again," he snarled, reaching for her arm. Sarah instinctively pulled back, her protective instincts kicking in as her hands moved to shield her pregnant belly. "Please, Officer Collins," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not resisting. I just need to move carefully because of my condition." She gestured to her obvious pregnancy, but this seemed to only anger him more. "Don't tell me how to do my job." His voice echoed down the empty street. He grabbed her arm roughly, trying to pull her from the car. Sarah cried out in pain, tears now flowing freely down her face. "You're hurting me," she exclaimed, her free hand still protecting her belly. "My baby. Please, you're going to hurt my baby." But Officer Collins wasn't listening. His grip tightened as he tried to force her out of the vehicle. Sarah's feet scrambled against the car floor, trying to brace herself while still being careful of her condition. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Stop resisting," Officer Collins shouted, though Sarah was doing nothing but trying to protect herself and her unborn child. His face was now red with rage, a vein pulsing in his forehead. Sarah's hospital ID badge swung wildly from her neck as she struggled to remain calm. "Officer, I'm Sarah Thompson. I'm an administrator at Memorial Hospital. Please check my ID. I haven't done anything wrong." Her words fell on deaf ears as Officer Collins reached across her to unbuckle her seatbelt. The rough movement caused the belt to tighten painfully across her pregnant belly, making her cry out again. In the distance, car doors were opening and closing. People were gathering, their phones held up like tiny beacons in the dark. But Officer Collins seemed blind to his audience, consumed by an anger that had no rational explanation. "Exit the vehicle now, or I'll have to use force," he threatened, his free hand moving to his taser. Sarah's eyes widened in horror at the sight of the weapon. "No, please, I'm pregnant," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "You could kill my baby." The dashcam in Sarah's car continued recording, its tiny red light blinking steadily as it captured every moment of the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. The camera caught everything, his twisted expressions, his aggressive gestures, the way he ignored her pleas about her pregnancy. Sarah's phone lay on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with incoming calls. Her husband's picture flashed on the screen. He always called to check on her after her night shift, but she couldn't reach for it. Couldn't tell him what was happening, couldn't call for help. Officer Collins's grip on her arm tightened even more. "Last warning," he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. His other hand was still on his taser, the threat clear and terrifying. Sarah's mind raced with horrible stories she'd seen on the news. Other innocent black people hurt or worse by police officers who lost control. She couldn't let that happen, not with her baby's life at stake too. Through her tears, she noticed movement in her rearview mirror. More cars had stopped. More phones were recording. But one figure was different from the rest, an elderly Asian man in a suit, walking purposefully toward them. There was something about his calm, determined approach that made Sarah's racing heart skip a beat. Officer Collins didn't see him coming. He was too focused on Sarah, too lost in his inexplicable rage. His finger was moving toward the taser's trigger, his face set in a mask of unreasoning anger. The night air was filled with the sounds of Sarah's frightened breathing, Officer Collins's angry shouts, and the quiet footsteps of the approaching stranger who was about to change everything. "Officer Collins," the voice cut through the night air like a knife, sharp and full of authority. "Step away from the vehicle immediately." Judge Michael Chen stood just a few feet away, his phone still recording in one hand, his federal judge ID held firmly in the other. His voice carried the weight of his 30 years on the bench, commanding attention and respect. Officer Collins's head snapped around, his hand still gripping Sarah's arm. "This is a police matter. Step back," he barked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I am retired federal judge Michael Chen," the judge announced clearly, his voice carrying to the growing crowd of onlookers. "And I have been recording your conduct for the past 10 minutes. He took another step forward, his expression stern but controlled. "You have a pregnant woman in distress, your body camera is off, and you're escalating a situation without cause." Sarah felt Officer Collins's grip on her arm loosen slightly. She remained still, hardly daring to breathe, tears still running down her face. "Your Honor," Officer Collins started, his tone suddenly changing. This woman," Judge Chen interrupted firmly, "has been completely cooperative. I witnessed the entire interaction." He moved closer, his phone still recording. "Now, I strongly suggest you step back, turn on your body camera, and explain to me why you pulled over a pregnant hospital administrator at this hour." More cars were stopping now. Phone cameras glowed in the darkness like fireflies as people recorded the scene. Someone in the crowd started a live stream, capturing every word. Officer Collins finally released Sarah's arm, taking a small step back. His face had lost its angry red color, replaced by a growing paleness as he realized the situation had spiraled far beyond his control. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Chen addressed Sarah directly, his voice gentler now. "Are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah's hand moved protectively over her belly as she nodded, still trembling. I think I need to get checked out," she managed to say. "He pulled me pretty hard." A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was wearing scrubs and had clearly just finished her own hospital shift. "I'm a nurse at St. Mary's," she announced. "Let me check on her." Judge Chen nodded his approval, then turned back to Officer Collins. "Your supervisor has been called," he stated matter-of-factly. "I suggest you wait in your vehicle until they arrive." Officer Collins stood frozen for a moment, his hand dropping away from his taser. The crowd had grown larger, and whispers rippled through it as people recognized the name Judge Chen. His reputation for handling civil rights cases was well known in the community. "And officer," Judge Chen added, his voice carrying clearly in the night air, "I noticed you reached for your taser earlier. Were you really planning to use it on a pregnant woman?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Officer Collins's face twitched, but he had no answer. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, defeated. The nurse had reached Sarah's car and was gently checking her vital signs. "Your pulse is racing, honey," she said softly. "We should get you to the hospital to make sure everything's okay with the baby." Judge Chen approached Sarah's window, lowering his phone but keeping it recording. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to stay here until more officers arrive. Would you like me to call anyone for you?" Sarah's phone was still lighting up with her husband's calls. With shaking hands, she finally reached for it. "My husband. He's probably worried sick." In the distance, more police sirens wailed, getting closer. Red and blue lights reflected off the buildings as several patrol cars approached. Judge Chen stood straight and tall, his presence a shield between Sarah and any further harm. The crowd of witnesses remained, their phones still recording, ensuring that what had started as a routine traffic stop but nearly became a tragedy would not go unnoticed or unaddressed. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital was oddly quiet when Marcus Thompson burst through the doors. His white doctor's coat flapped behind him as he ran, having left his patients the moment he got Sarah's tearful call. The nurse at the front desk recognized him immediately and pointed him toward room 108. He found Sarah lying on her side on the examination bed, a fetal monitor strapped to her belly. Her eyes were still red from crying, but she managed a weak smile when she saw him. Judge Chen stood near the window, talking quietly on his phone while a police sergeant took notes nearby. "Baby, what happened to you?" Marcus rushed to Sarah's side, taking her hand. His eyes fell on the bruises forming on her arm where Officer Collins had grabbed her. "The baby's okay," Sarah said quickly, knowing that would be his first concern. "They're just monitoring to be sure." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. The nurse who had helped at the scene, her name was Jenny Martinez, entered the room with a tablet. "The baby's heartbeat is strong and regular," she reported with a reassuring smile. "But we'd like to keep Mrs. Thompson for a few more hours for observation." Outside the hospital room, the situation was spreading like wildfire across social media. Videos from multiple angles showed Officer Collins's aggressive behavior, Judge Chen's intervention, and everything in between. The hospital's PR department was already fielding calls from news organizations. "Mrs. Thompson," the police surgeon said, approaching her bed, "I'm Surgeon Williams. I want to assure you that Officer Collins has been placed on immediate administrative leave. We'll need your statement when you feel up to it." Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched the video Judge Chen had recorded. "This could have been so much worse," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "if Judge Chen hadn't been there." "But I was there," Judge Chen said, finishing his phone call and joining them. "And more importantly, everything was recorded. Not just by me, but by at least a dozen other witnesses." He turned to Sarah. "The chief of police himself is on his way here. This incident will not be swept under the rug." Sarah winced as another nurse examined the bruises on her arm, photographing them for evidence. The door opened again, and a small group of community leaders entered, pastors, activists, and local officials who had heard about the incident and came to show their support. "We got your back, Mrs. Thompson," Reverend Jackson, a well-known civil rights activist, assured her. "The whole community does." He showed her his phone, where hundreds of supportive messages were already pouring in on social media. The fetal monitor beat steadily, its rhythm reassuring. Dr. Chen, the hospital's chief obstetrician, had already examined Sarah and confirmed that while she was stressed, both she and the baby appeared to be doing well. "What happens next?" Marcus asked Judge Chen, his arm protectively around his wife. "Justice happens next," Judge Chen replied firmly. "I've already spoken with several civil rights attorneys who are willing to take your case. Officer Collins's record will be thoroughly investigated. But right now," he added gently, "your wife needs rest and care." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, exhausted from the ordeal. When she opened them again, she saw the room had filled with even more supporters. her colleagues from the hospital administration, nurses from her department, and even some of her patients' families who had heard the news. Outside her window, a small group had gathered with candles, holding a peaceful vigil. News vans were pulling up to the hospital, their lights bright in the early morning darkness. The story was growing, becoming something bigger than just one traffic stop gone wrong. "Try to rest," Marcus whispered to Sarah, kissing her forehead. "I'm not leaving your side." Judge Chen watched the scene from the window, his phone still in his hand. In all his years on the bench, he had seen countless cases of injustice, but this time he had been able to stop it before it became another tragedy. This time there would be accountability. This time, change would come. Captain Lisa Rodriguez sat at her desk in the Internal Affairs office, surrounded by stacks of files. Her computer screen showed paused footage from the previous night's incident. Sarah Thompson's terrified face frozen in the frame. It was 9 a.m., and she had already watched the videos 20 times. "Bring me everything on Officer Collins," she had ordered her team early that morning. "Every complaint, every incident report, every evaluation. I want it all." Now, spread across her desk, the pattern was becoming clear, and it was disturbing. 6 complaints of excessive force in the past 3 years. 4 of them involved black drivers. All had been dismissed or buried under paperwork. Captain Rodriguez's hand tightened around her coffee cup as she read. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Detective James Wilson entered, carrying another stack of files. "Captain, you need to see this," he said, placing a folder on her desk. "We found more complaints against Collins from his previous department in another city. They were never transferred to our system." Captain Rodriguez opened the folder, her expression growing darker as she read. 3 more racial bias complaints," she muttered. "All swept under the rug." She looked up at Detective Wilson. "Who handled these cases?" "That's the interesting part," Wilson replied, pulling out another document. "Lieutenant Parker signed off on most of them. The same Lieutenant Parker who fast-tracked Collins's transfer to our department." The captain leaned back in her chair, pieces falling into place. Lieutenant Parker had been in charge of hiring when Collins joined their force. He had also been recently promoted to oversee internal investigations, until today. "Get me Chief Johnson on the phone," she said firmly. "This goes deeper than one officer." Across town, at the police department's main office, Chief Johnson was holding an emergency meeting with his command staff. Judge Chen's video played on the large screen, along with footage from witnesses and nearby security cameras. The evidence was overwhelming. "This is not just about Officer Collins anymore," the chief announced to the silent room. "This is about our whole system. How did we miss these warning signs? How many other officers have similar complaints buried in their files?" Back in Internal Affairs, Captain Rodriguez's team worked tirelessly. They pulled records, interviewed officers, and dug through years of paperwork. Each new discovery painted a clearer picture of systemic problems that had been ignored for too long. "Captain," Detective Wilson called from his desk, "I found something else. Remember the traffic stop last year, the one with the college student? Collins's body camera was off then too. It's a pattern." Captain Rodriguez added this to her growing timeline. The wall of her office was now covered with photos, documents, and sticky notes, all connected with red string. It looked like something from a crime show, but this was real, and it involved their own department. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chief Johnson. "Press conference in 1 hour. Bring everything you have." In the hospital, Sarah Thompson was giving her official statement to investigators. Judge Chen sat with her, making sure every detail was properly recorded. His presence gave her strength as she relived the terrifying moments of the previous night. "And you're certain Officer Collins never stated why he pulled you over?" the investigator asked. "Never," Sarah confirmed. "He just became aggressive immediately." Judge Chen spoke up. "I've reviewed traffic camera footage from the area. Mrs. Thompson was driving perfectly legally. There was no valid reason for the stop." Captain Rodriguez received this information in real time, adding it to her report. The case was growing beyond Officer Collins, revealing problems that would require major departmental changes to fix. As the morning turned to afternoon, more evidence emerged. Other officers began coming forward, sharing stories of misconduct they had witnessed but felt powerless to report. The blue wall of silence was cracking. In her office, Captain Rodriguez pinned one final document to her wall, a draft of new departmental policies that would help prevent similar incidents in the future. But first, they had to clean house. She gathered her files and headed to the press conference. It was time for the truth to come out, all of it. The department would never be the same, and that was exactly what needed to happen. 2 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest conference room was packed with reporters. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking as Chief Johnson approached the podium. Captain Rodriguez stood to his right, her face serious. Judge Chen sat in the front row beside Sarah and Marcus Thompson. Today, Chief Johnson began, his voice firm and clear. We are announcing several major decisions following our investigation into the incident involving Officer James Collins. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. Officer Collins has been terminated from our department, effective immediately. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled in their notebooks. But this is just the beginning, the chief continued. Our investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct that goes beyond one officer. Lieutenant David Parker has been suspended pending further investigation, and 3 other supervisors have been placed on administrative leave. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand as they listened. Her belly had grown noticeably in the past 2 weeks, and her bruises had faded, but the memory of that night remained vivid. Judge Chen had stayed involved, guiding them through the process and ensuring justice was served. Furthermore, Chief Johnson announced, "We are implementing immediate changes in our department." He gestured to Captain Rodriguez, who stepped forward with a thick document. "All officers will now undergo mandatory bias training," she stated clearly. "Body cameras must be on during every interaction with the public, no exceptions. Any officer who turns off their camera will face immediate suspension." In the back of the room, Reverend Jackson nodded approvingly. He had been working with the department to develop these new policies, ensuring community input was heard and respected. The chief then addressed another crucial point. We are also establishing a new civilian oversight committee. This committee will review all complaints against officers and have real power to recommend disciplinary action. Sarah noticed tears in the eyes of some community members present. These changes were what they had been fighting for years to achieve. Her traumatic experience had finally opened the door for real reform. Outside the conference room, Officer Collins was meeting with his union representative. His appeal had been denied. His personnel file, now public record, showed a history of biased behavior that could no longer be ignored or excused. "Mrs. Thompson," Chief Johnson said, turning to Sarah, "on behalf of our department, I want to publicly apologize for what you experienced. No one should ever face such treatment from law enforcement." Sarah stood carefully, one hand on her belly, and approached the podium. The room fell silent as she spoke. "This isn't just about me," she said clearly. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. These changes are a start, but we need to keep working to make sure they last." Judge Chen watched proudly from his seat. In his decades on the bench, he had seen many promises of reform, but this felt different. The evidence had been too clear, the public pressure too strong, and the leadership's commitment to change seemed genuine. Captain Rodriguez then announced the final piece of news. "We are reviewing every traffic stop and arrest made by Officer Collins and the other suspended officers over the past 5 years. Any cases involving misconduct will be reopened." Reporters' hands shot up with questions, but Sarah's attention was drawn to her phone. A message had just arrived from her lawyer. Officer Collins was facing criminal charges for his actions that night. Justice was taking its course. As the press conference ended, community members gathered around Sarah and Marcus, offering support and congratulations. What had started as a terrifying traffic stop had sparked real change in their city. "This is just the beginning," Judge Chen told them quietly. "Real change takes time, but today we've taken a big step forward." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of hope and determination. Her baby kicked, as if in agreement, and she smiled. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments in life could lead to the most important changes. Today was proof of that. 3 months later, Sarah Thompson sat in a comfortable chair at the front of the police academy's main lecture hall. Her newborn daughter, Hope, slept peacefully in her arms while Marcus stood proudly beside them. The room was filled with police cadets, all eyes focused on the small family. This is what community policing really means, Chief Johnson said, gesturing to Sarah and her baby. Every person you stop is someone's family member. Every interaction can change lives, for better or worse. Sarah had become a regular speaker at the Academy's new enhanced training program. Her story was now part of the curriculum, teaching future officers about bias, responsibility, and the importance of treating every citizen with respect. Judge Chen, sitting in the back of the room, smiled as he watched. The changes they had fought for were taking root. The new Civilian Oversight Committee, which he helped establish, was already making a difference. Complaints against officers had dropped by 40% in just 3 months. When Officer Collins pulled me over that night, Sarah told the cadets, her voice strong and clear, "You didn't see me as a person. You didn't see a pregnant hospital administrator heading home from work. You just saw what his bias wanted him to see." She looked down at her sleeping daughter. But because of what happened, things are changing. In the audience, Captain Rodriguez nodded. Her internal affairs department had been completely restructured. Every complaint was now thoroughly investigated, and body camera footage was regularly reviewed. The old system of covering up misconduct was gone. "Your body cameras are not just devices," Sarah continued, addressing the cadets. "They're a promise to the community, a promise of transparency and accountability." Several cadets nodded, touching the cameras on their uniforms. Outside the academy, the city itself was changing. The incident had sparked a movement. Community meetings with police officers happened regularly. Citizens felt more comfortable reporting problems, knowing they would be taken seriously. Trust was slowly being rebuilt. Former Officer Collins had pleaded guilty to charges of excessive force and civil rights violations. His case had become a warning to other officers about the consequences of misconduct. Lieutenant Parker and several other supervisors were facing charges of their own for covering up previous incidents. "But this isn't about punishment," Sarah explained to the cadets. "It's about learning and growing. It's about making sure our police department truly serves and protects everyone in our community." Little hope stirred in her sleep, and Sarah adjusted her blanket. Some of the cadets smiled at the baby, seeing the human impact of their future work. This wasn't just a training session, it was a reminder of what was at stake. Marcus stepped forward to share his perspective as both a doctor and a black man. He talked about the fear he had felt when Sarah called him that night, and his relief that Judge Chen had been there to help. His words helped the cadets understand the deep impact of their actions on families and communities. Judge Chen finally joined them at the front of the room. Despite his retirement, he had taken on a new role as an advisor to the police department's reform program. His experience and wisdom were helping guide the changes. "The law is important," he told the cadets, "but so is compassion. So is understanding. So is seeing every person you interact with as a human being worthy of respect." Sarah looked out at the young faces before her. These future officers would hit the streets with better training, better oversight, and a better understanding of their responsibilities. The night that could have ended in tragedy had instead become a catalyst for positive change. As the session ended, several cadets came forward to thank Sarah and to meet Baby Hope. One young officer in training, with tears in her eyes, promised to always remember this lesson. Outside the academy windows, the city stretched out under a bright sky. It wasn't perfect. Change never is, but it was getting better. Hope wasn't just the name of Sarah's daughter. It was what they all felt for the future. Sarah hugged her baby close, thinking about the world Hope would grow up in. Thanks to one difficult night and the courage of many people to demand change, it would be a little bit better, a little bit fairer, and a little bit more just.